And I'm really delighted to be able to do this presentation as part of the seminar series. I've enjoyed so much sitting through the ones over the last year and learning so much from them. And this presentation is going to focus on one of the 15 art collections that I've been researching that were put together by the sort of small but fairly conspicuous group of German Jewish migrants to London in the late Victorian and Edwardian eras. Some of those collections have been very well documented. You think, for example, of the Mond collection, which went into the National Gallery in London, or the Beit collection, much of which is now in the National Gallery of Ireland in Dublin. But others have disappeared altogether, and most were actually sold off after the deaths of their original collectors. And the Hirsch collection of Leopold and Mathilde Hirsch is exactly one of those. It was famous in its day, but now it's very much dissipated. And I've had great fun trying to piece it back together and marveling at the quality of the things which they collected in it. I'm not going to read out the paper that I've written on this. That will be perfectly available at my Gmail address. It'll come up right at the end of the talk, and I'm very happy to send it to anybody who would like to read it and see more of the pictures of the artworks themselves. Instead, what I hope to do in these slides is to go through the life of Leopold and Mathilde, look at some of the highlights of the collection, and then draw some conclusions as to what we can grasp from the act of collecting, what it means in relation to their identity and their culture, and particularly the juggling of their triple identities of both German, Jewish, and British at one and the same time. So if I kick off with a map of Germany as it is today, this shows on the red flag underneath Frankfurt the town of Heppenheim, which is where the Hirsch family came from. And I should say from the outset, this is not anything to do with the Baron von Hirsch, which we heard about last term. The Hirsch family, which we're dealing with, Leopold and Mathilde, are very different to them. They lived in Heppenheim in the Grand Duchy of Hesse. And if we zoom in on the Grand Duchy as it was at the time, I will drop a plumb line from the city of Darmstadt in the center, which was the capital of the Grand Duchy of Hesse, down to the university town of Heidelberg in the south. And if you look halfway down that line, you'll see the town of Heppenheim. And in fact, that line, that plumb line I've just dropped in, that represents the Bergstrasse, which connected Darmstadt and Heidelberg. And Heppenheim's full name as a town is Heppenheim an der Bergstrasse. So it sits on this wonderful hill road which snakes through the South Hessian countryside. You can see here from the view of it today, it's a very pleasant, very rich area with vineyards on both sides. It's actually been designated by UNESCO a global geopark. But perhaps the sort of greatest accolade it received was in the 18th century when the Habsburg Emperor Joseph II was traveling through it, and he said, "Ah, this is where Germany becomes Italy." And the town of Heppenheim itself is a very pleasant market town. This is the market square. And in fact, this is where the Hirsch family lived. If you see that mustard colored building on the left, the next door building to the left of that was the Hirsch family house. Very grand, very much in the center of the town. And the Hirsches were successful merchants in Heppenheim from the 18th century at least, and they were leading figures in a thriving Jewish community. Heppenheim, like many other towns in the Grand Duchy of Hesse, had very strong Jewish communities right the way into the 19th century. You can see the timber framing on the Rathaus, the town hall, straight ahead. That's very characteristic of these Hessian buildings, particularly where they've been reconditioned for tourism, as you can see here. But even in the older buildings, you can see the same timber framing. And I put this one up because this is in fact the old synagogue, which was in use from 1791 to 1900. The fact that it was no longer in use in the 1930s saved it from the depredations of Kristallnacht. The Hirsch family, as I say, were very big in Heppenheim, in the Jewish community, and they were leaders within the Jewish community itself. Here is a job advert from 1869 calling for a new religious teacher and cantor in the synagogue. It doubled up also as the shochet, the ritual slaughterer. And as you'll see at the bottom, it's signed on behalf of the executive board of the Jewish community by two members of the Hirsch family, Moses and Baruch Hirsch. And in fact, by the 1870s, all three members of that executive board of the Jewish community were from the Hirsch family. This is a very, very simplified family tree showing you the generation that we're going to be most interested in. Baruch Hirsch, as I mentioned, is the father, married Mina Meyer from the nearby town of Reichelsheim, which had an even larger Jewish community than Heppenheim had. And they had one daughter, Jeanette. You see there, she died very young in childbirth. And then three sons, Leopold, Adolf, and Heinrich Hirsch. All three of those sons would leave Heppenheim. All three would settle in London. All three would become stockbrokers, and very successful stockbrokers, and they would all in their own ways have art collections of varying degrees. But one of the interesting identity issues, perhaps to start with, is that they all became British subjects, so naturalized British subjects of the monarch, Queen Victoria at the time, but they retained a very strong German and Jewish identity. Heinrich, for example, the youngest brother, he was known in all the official documentation as Henry, but within the family he was still called Heinrich. But the greatest single piece of evidence of how much they retained their German Jewish links is this magnificent new synagogue, which they financed in Heppenheim after they'd left and were all living in London for many years. And both Leopold and Adolf Hirsch journeyed back to Heppenheim for the consecration of the new synagogue, which was called the Hirsch Synagogue, in October 1900. And this was the one which was destroyed at Kristallnacht. And so this idea of them still retaining a strong German Jewish identity and a link to Heppenheim is very well displayed in the dedication which was attached to the synagogue. It was in memory of their parents, but also, and I quote, as an everlasting expression of their love for their homeland. And we know that all the way through their lives, they continued to give to Heppenheim charities, both Jewish and non-Jewish. 1890 was the year in which Leopold Hirsch gained his British citizenship, so to speak, his naturalization as a British subject. And it was the same year that he got married. And he married Mathilde Seligman, who is shown here in this wonderful portrait by John Singer Sargent. Mathilde Seligman was the daughter of Isaac Seligman and Lena Seligman, née Messel. Isaac Seligman was the head of the London branch of the international banking empire of Seligman Brothers. And Mathilde, who was always known as Sissy throughout her life, I'm going to call her Mathilde for the rest of the talk, but she was always known in the family as Sissy. She was born in South London in a fantastic mansion, very near actually to where I am now sitting, in Clapham Park. So both her parents were born in Germany, both of them were German Jews, but she was brought up in London. And this portrait of her by Sargent was shown at the Royal Academy in 1902 to great acclaim. Everybody thought that the dress in particular was the most fantastic virtuoso display of drapery. The only dissenting voice was the Jewish Chronicle. The reviewer for the Jewish Chronicle said that they felt that the dress was singularly unbecoming and that the portrait was a bit of a failure as a result. I don't know, maybe they felt it was a little immodest. But at the same year, there was another portrait commissioned of Mathilde, this one by Sargent's friend, the Italian artist Antonio Mancini, and it shows Mathilde in a bit more of a characterful pose, stretched out on a chaise longue with a book on her lap, banked up with cushions. And certainly this corresponds to the nice images we have from within the family of her as a young mother. And this is the moment I think I can say a large thank you to Mathilde and Leopold's granddaughter, Joanna Capon, who has lent me these pictures from the family archive and has allowed them to be used in this talk. Perhaps the nicest photographs of Leopold and Mathilde come from within the Seligman family archive. In fact, they've been passed down into the Richard Levy family archive, and I'm very grateful to Michelle for allowing me to show them here. And this gives a picture of a young, up-and-coming, successful couple, which is exactly what they were. Leopold founded his own stockbroking firm, L. Hirsch & Co., and it prospered hugely as a result of the South African gold rush of the 1890s. His firm became the stockbroking firm to the dominant landlord company of Werner Beit & Co. And Otto Beit joined as a partner in L. Hirsch & Co. And it really became one of the big powerhouse stockbroking firms on the London Stock Exchange. And we can see the results of that success in the house that they bought in 1896. This is number 10 Kensington Palace Gardens. And for those of you who know London, this is now the area which is both on one side still embassy buildings, but otherwise known as Billionaires Row. And it was an absolutely vast mansion right in the centre of one of the most up-and-coming areas of London. This is how it looks today as it's been renovated by its current owner. It's owned at the moment by the founder of Foxton's estate agency, and he's busy digging 4 stories of basement under it to house his fleet of vintage Ferraris. He's in a great fight with the French ambassador who lives next door and hates this upheaval. But at the time, it was already an extraordinarily imposing mansion, and the Hirsches put a lot of effort into expanding it. They had 12 domestic servants as well as a Swiss governess, and that's at a time when having 3 domestic servants was enough to put you into the bracket of being in the upper middle class. So you can see that they were doing very well in setting up in such a prestigious place. And I thought that following one of the talks that we had last year, it would be quite fun just to map, excuse me, to map onto the central area of London where some of these German Jewish collectors who I've been looking at lived, where they set up their London homes. And you can see that the vast majority of them, I mean, there's only 13 or so on this particular map, but they lived in that area around Park Lane, Mayfair, and then stretching down into Belgravia. But if you look on the far left, to the west of Kensington Gardens, there are 2 dots there, one of which is Henry Oppenheimer, another great Renaissance collector, and Leopold and Mathilde Hirsch were his next door neighbours. And what I've done is I've looked at the post office directories for those years as well. And it's fascinating just to cast your eye down the list of people who lived in Kensington Palace Gardens. I've chosen 1920, but you could do this for many of the other years. I won't go through them all, but you can see I've crossed out all the non-Jewish ones, and 1 in 3 of the big mansions in Kensington Palace Gardens at that time was owned by Jewish families, and actually more than that, the vast majority by continental, or should we say Jewish families who had a heritage either in Germany or in the Netherlands. Number 12, the Earl of Rock Savage, as we know from Joseph's talk before, that is Sybil Sassoon, so from the Iraqi, Indian, Anglo-Jewish family of the Sassoons. And if you look down to number 17, Isaac Seligman, that's Mathilde's father, because Isaac and Lena Seligman, her parents, moved into Kensington Palace Gardens at pretty much the same time as Leopold and Mathilde moved in themselves. Now, that was their London residence. They also took out a long lease on a 17,000 acre grouse estate in the north of Scotland, in Sutherlandshire. And this is the estate, the Sooskill estate, not just for grouse shooting, but also for salmon fishing. And you can see the River Helmsdale flowing down through the middle of the picture. This wasn't a unique thing to do. You think, for example, of Arthur Sassoon and Sir Sigismund Neumann, other prominent Jews of the time who took big Scottish estates. But interestingly, those two deliberately took their estates much closer to Balmoral. And I think for them, it was very much part of being in that circle around the Prince of Wales and then later Edward VII. Leopold and Mathilde had no such aspirations to be part of that Jewish court. Sutherlandshire is much further north, and it seems that they really went for this because of its sporting opportunities and also to be able to play the role of the Scottish laird. Nearer to London, they also had the Littlecote Park estate. This is in Ramsbury in Wiltshire, very well known for this magnificent Elizabethan house, which was so highly praised by Vita Sackville-West in her book on English country houses. And it also is unique for having a Cromwellian chapel, one of the very, very few Cromwellian chapels to survive from the Commonwealth years, in which in 1913 their eldest daughter Margaret got married. And it's a good time perhaps to mention the fact that of their 4 children, 3 married outside the Jewish faith and only 1 married within, and that was the youngest son, Richard. He married Violet Levita within the Levita family, which was related in some respects to David Cameron, the former Prime Minister, as well. But this idea of them having a sort of joint identity of both country squires of the landed gentry, but also very highly cultured, urbane individuals, wasn't really in conflict. You can see on the right here this later portrait of Mathilde studying a new print that she's received in front of this rather nice Chinese wallpaper. But on the left, Leopold in the picture of a squire in front of his river with his salmon rod over his shoulder, his fly book in his hand. That was one of many portraits that they commissioned of themselves and indeed of the wider family. This one, in fact, by the young Scottish artist Robert Brough. And you know, there were many which they supplemented this with. They had Adrian Stokes, James Chibusa Shannon, the Russian Jewish sculptor Alexander Zeitlin, and then a series of portraits from Sir Oswald Burley. This is of the 2 boys, John and Richard, or Jack and Dick as they were called, on the Sutherlandshire estate, and Margaret, the eldest daughter, who I've mentioned already. But the last sort of evidence of cultural engagement that I wanted to throw up is in fact a musical one, even though it took place within this artistic setting. This is the Grafton Galleries off Bond Street. And on the 21st of June 1914, there was an evening reception held here in honour of Richard Strauss, who was over in London to conduct the British premiere of his new ballet, The Legend of Joseph. And on this evening, in the soiree that they held, Strauss played the piano part of his violin sonata, the violin part being played by Lady Speyer, Leonora Speyer, who was a virtuoso violinist. And in the audience of these rather sort of grand surroundings, you had people like Stravinsky, you had Debussy, you had Sir Edgar Speyer, and you had Mr. and Mrs. Leopold Hirsch. So it shows the sort of elite company in which they were mixing at the time. Now, 21st of June 1914 is 1 week to the day before the murder, the assassination in Sarajevo of Archduke Franz Ferdinand, which led then to the slide into war. And the advent of the First World War really changed the fortunes of the Hirsch family, as it did indeed for anyone of German origin living in Britain. In the run-up to the war, tensions between Britain and Germany had been rising, and there's lots of good books which chronicle the growing antagonism between Germany and Britain, really from the beginning of the century onwards. As war broke out, there were outbreaks of violence from time to time, October 1914 in particular. But then really the trigger for much greater violence came with the sinking of the Lusitania in May 1915. The Lusitania was a ship carrying passengers, non-combatants, and it went down with the loss of almost 1,200 lives, many of them women and children. And this sparked outrage, real outrage across the world, but particularly in Britain. And there were riots from Liverpool, Manchester, and then down into London when German shops and Austrian shops and anything with a German name to it were ransacked. And this is a fairly famous picture from Poplar in East London, showing one of those German establishments, in this case a tobacconist owned by Adolf Schoenfeld, being besieged and ransacked, and all of the possessions being thrown out into the streets. And this was a really sort of huge attack on people of German origin at the time. Interestingly, Schoenfeld himself was, it seems, also of Jewish heritage. But really, if you look at the media reports at the time, it was very much the German identity of the individuals which was the target of anger. There had been lots of blurring of lines between German and Jewish individuals at the very high end, at the millionaire end, but really that the common presence of German and Austrian shops on the high street, it was very much more as German butchers, German bakers, and other shops such as this one. And you can see in the media coverage, it was very much the German identity of these individuals that was the key target. And I should point out, these are not German citizens. They were all either interned or repatriated at the beginning of the war. These are the German-born, naturalized British subjects. And it had a huge effect. It was a very, very stressful time to be someone of German origin, especially if you had a German accent, which many of the German migrants kept all their lives. The stock exchange barred all people of German and Austrian heritage or origin for the duration of the war. So Leopold Hirsch and his brothers were no longer allowed access to the stock exchange. And in 1915, just after the sinking of the Lusitania, a call went out through Sir Arthur Pinero, the playwright. He wrote a letter to the Times saying this is the moment for anyone of German origin to make a public declaration of which side they're on. And Leopold Hirsch was one of the very, very first, the very next day in the Times, his loyalty letter, as they were called, his loyalty letter was published saying, I absolutely deprecate the appalling behavior of the Germans and the appalling way in which they're fighting this war, and I reiterate my loyalty to king and to country. The Hirsches in a way were fortunate. Both of their sons survived the war. Both of their daughters came through the war as well. But it was clearly a very stressful time, and Mathilde's health in particular went into decline, and she died in 1921 just after her 50th birthday. Leopold continued, and he lived on till 1932 when he also died. And they're buried in the Willesden Jewish Cemetery in North London. They were they were practicing members of the West London Synagogue, and they were buried here in the family plot, which I was able to visit in the very few times that we were able to do anything outside the home. I went there in October last year and found the plot and took this picture of it. After Leopold's death, 18 months after, the collection that they had formed went up for sale at Christie's, and it was a major event in the cultural calendar. If you look at the cover of the catalogue on the left, you'll see it was for the furniture, the porcelain, the objets d'art, the tapestry. That went on for 3 days. There was then a day devoted to the silver collection, and then the climax of the sale came on the Friday of the week, when the pictures and the drawings and engravings went up for sale. And the Times heralded this as being the most important sale at Christie's for many, many years. There were lots of previews of it in the press. In the top left-hand corner is from the Burlington magazine, which gave about 3 or 4 previews. You can see a full page on the right from the Sphere. The Illustrated London News gave it 2 full-page spreads, this one devoted to the furniture and the tapestries. And the Connoisseur magazine gave it a 6-page preview, including the porcelains and the furniture and the fine art. So this was really a collection that was known, it was esteemed at the time, and the sale over the period of that whole week made very close to £100,000, which is, in current terms, if you take the labour value of that today, it's something like a £20 million haul. So I will go through some of the highlights of this great collection, really to give you a flavour of the sorts of things which they collected and which made this a special ensemble. And particularly starting with the Renaissance collection, because this is really, I think, the series of jewels which they put together. They had quite a lot of portraits, and in fact quite a few pairs of portraits. One of the nicest examples is this pair by Christoph Amberger, the Bavarian painter from the 16th century. This is the accountant Matthias Schwarz and his wife Barbara. And you can see, even though he may have had a job as an accountant, he was also known as a bon viveur. You can see the glass of wine behind him on the window ledge in front of this rather dramatic scene outside. Unfortunately, the pair has been split up now. His portrait, Matthias's portrait on the left, is in the Thyssen-Bornemisza Museum in Madrid. Barbara's portrait on the right went up for sale at Sotheby's 4 years ago and fetched just under £800,000. But it's quite nice to think of the German identity of the collectors being reflected in their interest in German painters of the Renaissance, as well as this Amberger pair. They had a pair of portraits by Conrad Faber, the Frankfurt-based painter. They had works by Dürer, by Cranach, by Hans Schüchlin of Ulm. They also had a work by Holbein, although the attribution of that has now changed. But it wasn't by any means only the German painters who they collected. This is another rather charming pair of portraits, this time by the Dutch-French painter Corneille de Lion. This is the Duc et Duchesse d'Étampes, and again the 2 portraits have been split up, but both came up for sale in the last 10 years. They had individual portraits. This is a much larger work by Antonis Moore, one of his masterpieces, and it shows a lady with a parrot, as it's now called, but it was always thought to be a portrait of Marie de Guise, the mother of Mary, Queen of Scots, and so it's quite appropriate that it's now at the Hunterian Museum in Glasgow. This even grander portrait by Tintoretto of a man with a landscape behind is now in the National Gallery of Art in Washington, DC. The landscape is meant to be Martin de Vos. And these type of wonderful works from the Renaissance, I think, are encapsulated really well in this portrait here, which at the time was considered to be a portrait of the young Raphael by his father, Giovanni Santi, and it was always known by that, and it was sold out of the Hirsch collection as a portrait of that, of Raphael. It has since been upgraded. Its current owners, again the Thyssen-Bornemisza Museum in Madrid, have said that this is a portrait of a young boy from the Montefeltro family, and it's by none other than Piero della Francesca. Not everybody has agreed with this, but certainly it shows you that these are real sort of jewels of Renaissance art. As well as the portraits, they had a number of works from a religious themes. This one originally was attributed to Hugo van der Goes. It's now thought to be by the master of the embroidered foliage, which, as you'll see from the way in which the trees and the bushes are depicted, that fits very well. It's a depiction of Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden. You'll see on the right-hand side at the back the devil in the form, not of a serpent, but of a salamander. And it's a very vivid, very colourful display with this very detailed, intricate depiction of the flowers in the foreground. You can see the iris in the middle with the daffodil and the aquilegia and then the daylilies. A vibrant, luminous work. It was actually one of 3 of the same theme, and the one on the right is actually the one that the Hirsches owned, not the one on the left. I wanted to show you it in its full colour, in its full glory. The Hirsch one went into a private collection in Basingstoke, and we don't know where it's got to since, so there are no colour reproductions of it. One which was absolutely in the Hirsch collection is this gorgeous triptych, a tempera on vellum of the Virgin Mary with child, and on the left St. Catherine with her broken wheel, on the right St. Barbara with her tower. And this is an absolutely wonderful work which I've enjoyed looking at so much, and it's one of the perhaps positive sides of doing one of these presentations online, is that you can see the detail far better than you could if it was in a big theatre hall with a projection onto a screen. You can see the delicacy in terms of the drapery. If you even just look at the cloak which St. Barbara is wearing on the right, this wonderful shock of ultramarine from the Virgin's robe picked up in St. Barbara's robe and in the sleeves of St. Catherine on the left. And then just the delicacy of the way in which the hair is portrayed, not just of the 3 female figures, but also of the infant Jesus as well, with his little curls. It's a wonderfully delicate, wonderfully evocative picture. And maybe because of that delicacy, it was ascribed at the time to the female artist from the 15th century Netherlands, Cornelia Knoop. It's now in the Museum of Fine Arts in Houston, and it has been ascribed now to her slightly later compatriot Simon Benning, but that no way takes away from the gorgeous delicacy of the piece, in my opinion. But really the most arresting, the most dramatic of all of the Renaissance works which the Hirsches had in their collection is this extraordinary masterpiece, masterpiece and altarpiece from the Church of San Marco in Florence. It is a portrayal of the Volto Santo di Lucca. It's a statue of Christ in the Tuscan town of Lucca, and it was a very, very famous painting, really all the way from the earliest times. Vasari mentions it in his Life of Cosimo Rosselli. It was shown in Britain in the 1857 Manchester Fine Art Exhibition, and subsequently many times since. So this was a very famous work, but perhaps more importantly, it was an enormous work. Even without its frame, this is 2 meters by 2 meters, so sort of 6 foot by 7 foot. And if you see it in its tabernacle frame, which is how it's now portrayed in the Los Angeles County Museum of Art, it's 10 foot by 9 foot, so roughly 3 meters by 3 meters. So it's a very, very imposing piece of Christian iconography for any family to have in their home, let alone a practicing Jewish family. And if you look a little bit more closely at that iconography, this is not a crucifixion scene. This is Christ the King shown with his gold crown rather than the crown of thorns, his resplendent robe with the embroidery on it. And he stands, if you look at his right foot, on the chalice. And that's because this was actually a sacramental altarpiece to be used in the Mass, so that when the priest elevated the chalice in 3D, in real life, he would elevate it in front of the 2D representation in the altarpiece itself. And if you want any further sense of how bizarre or how perhaps unusual it would be to have such a strong work of Christian iconography in a Jewish household. Look at the figure on the left-hand side, the Dominican friar on the left of the picture, holding open the Bible at the book of Revelation. This is St. Vincent Ferrer, who was known as one of the chief converters of the Jews of Spain in the 15th century. So it would really have raised perhaps some eyebrows amongst people who knew their history and knew who was being portrayed here. But perhaps this does show that by this time, these sacred works had much more significance through their art historical identity rather than through their sacred identity. And indeed, the Hirsches had a large number of other Renaissance works of Christian iconography. This rather wonderful, again, very, very vivid lamentation over the dead Christ is from the 16th century Antwerp Mannerist school. But again, this enormous altarpiece, which was also in the Hirsch collection right at the beginning of the century, is a Botticelli altarpiece, 7 foot by 6 foot, showing the Holy Trinity of God, the Spirit, and the Christ in the crucifixion, with Mary Magdalene on the left and John the Baptist on the right, and the smaller figures of Tobias and the angel in the front. We know this was in the Hirsch collection in 1902 because they lent it to be shown at the Royal Academy Winter Exhibition of Old Masters. But there was some dispute as to its attribution at the time, and they seem to have given it back to the dealer from whom they bought it, this wonderfully named dealer called Lesser, who dealt out of Bond Street, and it was in his collection when it was sold out in 1912 and before it was re-established as being a genuine Botticelli. It's now in the Courtauld Institute and it's understood by everybody to be a genuine Botticelli. But perhaps this is a moment I can just briefly talk about the dealers with whom the Hirsches made their collection. Lesser was one, Jacques Seligman another, David Isaacs another of the Jewish dealers from whom they got a lot of their furniture, and of course Duveen brothers. Leopold Hirsch was a friend of Lord Duveen and seems to have been much more than just a customer of his. They seem to have exchanged a lot of intelligence about what was coming onto the market. It wasn't in any sense just from Jewish dealers that they bought. They also bought from Colnaghi's, they bought from Dowdeswell's, but they didn't seem to have any one artistic advisor. They seem to do a lot of this work themselves and to enjoy the whole process of being in the art market. Many of the works which their contemporaries collected were focused on the 17th century Dutch and Flemish masters. And even though Leopold and Mathilde really focused more on the Renaissance period, they did have some choice works from the Dutch Golden Age, including this scene of 3 children making music, which is now in the National Gallery in London, by Jan Mienza Molenaar. They also had other works, landscapes by Mankadden, by Mika, but perhaps really head and shoulders above all of them was this magnificent panel portrait of an old man with a fur-lined hat by Rembrandt, which was seen at the time as well as being one of the highlights of the collection. I say by Rembrandt, but actually it's now been downgraded to being by a follower of Rembrandt. It's in the Indianapolis Museum. But again, that in no way takes away from the power of what's a really astonishing portrait, I think. All collections of the time had to have some series of 18th century grand manner portraits, and the Hirsches were absolutely no exception in this regard. This is one of 5 portraits they had by Sir Joshua Reynolds, again vast pieces in a very big house. This is one of Alexander Wedderburn, Lord Loughborough, which is now appropriately in Lincoln's Inn. He was the Lord Chancellor of the time. And again, it's worth reflecting that for a German Jewish family in London, having these grand works on the wall was not just about celebrating the British tradition of portraiture from the 18th century. It was also about the reflected glory, the cachet of having these grand figures of the establishment around you. Even if they weren't your family, you were still, by association, basking in some of the reflected glory of their lives. But it wasn't all like that. They had some very charming works as well. They had a series by Sir Henry Raeburn, and this one of the Allen brothers was clearly one of their favourites, and indeed it was one which made the most money in the 1934 sale. This went for 10,500 guineas as the most expensive lot in the auction. Another of the large portraits which did very well at the sale was this one by Romney of Mrs. Thomas Raikes. This is now in Adelaide at the Art Gallery of South Australia. And indeed the same gallery has one of their two major Gainsborough portraits, this one of Madame Francesca Lebrun, who was an Italian opera singer of the time. But their other major Gainsborough portrait was of Queen Charlotte, which is now in the Met in New York. They had some lovely portraits by Thomas Lawrence. This is my favorite, of Miss Harriet Clements. Again, this one's in Indianapolis. It's a fantastic work, life size. And again, you can imagine living with this very, very easily, even though it was a very large work. But down at the other end of the scale, they had an extensive collection of miniatures, both from the 18th century, like this one by John Smart, and also earlier from the schools around Nicholas Hilliard and others, all absolutely beautifully enameled with jewels round, like you see the diamonds and the oval surround of this one. They had a collection of pastel paintings by John Russell, the chief pastelist of the 18th century. This one again in the National Gallery of Art in Washington, DC. And they also had more modern works as well. This enormous picture by G.F. Watts of Ariadne on Naxos, which is now in the Harvard Art Museums, is one of the sort of most imposing of the modern works they had. But they had a lot of smaller ones, drawings by Augustus John, by the Dutch Jewish painter Joseph Israels, and by Murray Bone, and also this charming picture of Saint Elizabeth of Hungary spinning wool for the poor, which is by Marianne Stokes, one of the foremost women painters in London at the end of the 19th century, and married to Adrian Stokes, who we heard about earlier as having done the portrait of Mathilde. And it wasn't just paintings. They had an extraordinary collection of other treasures, such as this enamel chasse from the 13th century showing the murder of Thomas à Becket, which is now in the Burrell collection in Glasgow. They had an extensive collection of Renaissance bronzes from Italy, including this Giambologna of Mercury. The enormous collection of extraordinary Chippendale and Sheraton furniture I've mentioned, and also the French furniture on top. They even had antiquities, these Egyptian figurines, one on the left of Onuris, the one on the right, which is 2 foot tall, of Sekhmet, and indeed this fantastic collection of porcelain, both Chinese from the Famille Verte, like you see there, but also Dresden, Sèvres, Limoges enamels, you name it, they had it. And really the sort of final thing to say on their collection is, when one of the contemporaries who visited it wrote it up in a paper at the time, they just said that the Hirsches have managed to transform their home at 10 Kensington Palace Gardens into a palace of art. And when you look through the collection, it's really that which leads you as the greatest impression. So my final slide is to try to draw from this just some of the conclusions as to how art and the collecting of art in this respect interfaces with the idea of their national identities. Because the Hirsch family like other German Jewish migrants to Britain, they juggled this triple identity of being on the one hand German, and particularly German in relation to their cultural background, on the other Jewish, and in their respect, this was a faith which they kept throughout their lives, certainly in this generation, whereas many of the German Jewish migrants to Britain, as we know from the work of Todd Endelman and others, they drifted away from their faith. And also, of course, they were British. They were British in terms of their state affiliation, and in the First World War, they were made to choose and declare publicly that they were British rather than German. So this triple identity and how to negotiate this triple identity was a constant cause, a constant source of tension for them. But art and the collecting of art enabled them to transcend those national boundaries by reference to this pan-European patrimony, which is accessible to all. I mean, if we go, for example, to the Sainsbury wing of the National Gallery, we don't go there as British tourists to an Italian schools. We go there because it is part of our European heritage. And the collecting of art is obviously at another level as well, but really, even just engagement with art at that level, it is something to which we can all aspire if we are prepared to raise our own cultural game to meet it at its level. And this concept was absolutely central in the German context to the ideal of Bildung, this ideal of self-cultivation, of the development of one's own intellectual and aesthetic and spiritual self as something which went on throughout one's lifestyle, throughout one's lifetime, so that one would indeed be able to engage with art at the highest level. And it's not just something which was German, it was particularly important for German Jews. And this has been the focus of the other bits of research I've been doing into Bildung as a socio-cultural driver of art collecting for German Jews, and which I hope to present in Paris later on in the context of the Jewish Country Houses program. This idea that when you collect art, you are able to transcend not just your identity as a national figure, but also to transcend any of the prejudices which were leveled at the nouveau riche of the time, because it was a commonly held charge then as now that the nouveau riche, yes, they might be able to buy all these great works of art and they might be able to create these fantastic treasure houses in their homes, but they never really understood them. They were just doing it because they knew they should. They were parvenus, and they were never really going to be on the level with those who'd been brought up to understand these things. Well, the collecting of art was really about constructing an identity which said, no, we are connoisseurs, we are engaging with art at this high level. And really the final thing to say is that the Hirsches are a perfect example of success in transcending all of these prejudices, transcending any of the boundaries of national identity. When you read the media reports of the Hirsch collection afterwards, it's all about the taste, the knowledge, the discrimination, and the understanding that the Hirsches brought to the construction of their collection. And there's absolutely no mention of a national identity. There's no mention of them being German or Jewish or British or anything else. And I think it's fascinating at that time when the international art market was really beginning to flourish as an international market at the beginning of the 20th century, that the Hirsches showed what was possible in transforming themselves into these figures of transnational connoisseurs beyond any national identity and beyond any of the tropes which afflicted the nouveau riche and particularly afflicted nouveau riche Jews at the time. So thank you very much. I'm conscious that I've put a lot into that. If anyone does wish to have a copy of the written paper, do please send me an email and I'll be happy to share it. But now I will stop and hopefully open up for discussion. Thank you.